guys, to start off, Darren, you went to, what was that? An annual recap? The state of the California real estate market? What was it?
Yes, so I'm a member of the AAGLA, which is the Apartment Owners Association of Greater Los Angeles. They are, in my opinion, one of the more neutral groups, understanding of tenant-landlord dynamics, and they explain things very well, and they want to make it work for everyone involved. So I attended their annual review, which often they have a keynote speaker. It was a very well-known keynote speaker in Joel Singer, been in the real estate environment with the Association of Realtors, through AAGLA, and at the state level for, gosh, I think it's been like 40 years now. Yeah,
I think he's finally retiring is what I learned.
Yeah. And he also, there were like 6 local state assembly members talking about, different things going on in their areas and how to, make sense of it all and how to go forward. So it was a good event.
Well, I know we highlighted this as past, present, future. How do you want to open it up?
I can just jump right into the notes. Yeah. I think everybody is, there is probably one thing that almost everyone is in agreement on, and that is that, what's happening in its whole is not quite effective. There's problems. Adjustments need to be made. And obviously, whenever you say that, some people think they need to be made in one direction and other people think in the other direction. It's the bottom line. They started off, that's why we went to a history, a little bit of evolution to how we got where we are. And that's always important when you're talking about trying to find solutions. So I couldn't help but ad-lib a little bit in my summary, and I'll point out when I'm ad-libbing, going off topic from their event. But, so the first one, I'm 50-ish, and I wasn't buying real estate in the 70s, so I didn't know this. And the first thing he started off by saying, which was a surprise to me, was that in the 70s, California was one of the more affordable states in the country. Wow. Now pause for a second. My whole lifetime, I when I was paying attention at all in the smallest amount, no, that wasn't the case. It's always been a more expensive place to be, particularly in Los Angeles, where we are in a big city. But on average, the state was much more affordable at one time. So by the late 80s, that had flipped. And there are many reasons why. We'll talk about a few of those reasons. They talk about a few of these reasons. But by the late 80s, we had an undersupply of homes, and it's not complicated. We repeat it constantly. This is a supply and demand driven market in real estate. So when there's less supply, prices rise. It's that simple. More supply, prices will go down. And that's always been the ebb and flow of real estate. For whatever reason, the supply rises or reduces. There's a lot of different factors that determine that, but it's always supply-demand based that will determine the price. So currently, then with that in mind, currently affordability stands at 27% for the state. Understand this. We just say, can it get worse? Yeah, it can. It was worse in the recent, not too distant past. In 2006, we were as low as 12%.
So could you help me understand that? When you say 27% affordability, that's based on what? How should I think about that?
So they're basically taking the cost of a home to purchase, and based on how much income people make, and they determine what percentage of people can afford to purchase an average priced home. So when you look at California and you say our average price is in the range of $700,000 to $800,000 for the state, and sure, there are areas that are lower, there are clearly areas that are higher, but they have to come up with some reference point, and that's how they determine that reference point. So for the average price in the state, only basically 1 out of 4 people can afford to buy a home. Whether they want to or not, that's not the point. But going back to 2006, that number got as low as 12%, which is an insanely low number. So, you know, and the other thing they pointed out with this 27% is they said that, and that's under this very low interest rate environment. Now, I see history repeating itself because I was in real estate back in 03, 04, 05, 06, 07, and there was a similar continual conversation. You know, it's become kind of the way economics are managed on some level, particularly at the federal level, where they're afraid to raise rates to understimulate the economy, and often they're looking at how it's going to relate to housing. So they kept rates artificially low back in that era to continue to stimulate the economy. There wasn't a bigger reason like we have now with COVID. I think there's a bigger reason to keep rates low, to keep the overall, I mean, obviously it's a much bigger reason now, but it's having a similar effect on housing, where it's keeping the prices up. Now when rates rise, that will probably be the biggest shift to slowing down the housing market. And then it goes back to supply and demand again. But when rates rise, that number of affordability will go down, because most likely income is not going to rise at the same time. Although that also could happen. We are seeing a shortage of available workers. And again, supply demand, wages will rise if that trend continues as well. He made an interesting comment that I thought was funny. He said, people in California are voting with their feet. I'm like, what the hell does he mean by that, man? He was referencing, you know, in the last year, we had the first population decrease in California in a long time. He cited since the 1800s, but somehow I feel maybe after the housing crisis, but you know, he's the expert. So yeah, 261,000 lower population in our state. And you know, they cited that based on housing, the cost of housing. And it makes sense. It's the majority of most people's budget. So the bottom line is, those who are fighting more housing, fighting permits, fighting development, these are the components that have driven the prices up. Less of it means the price rises. So we need more housing. And I think we need to find better solutions to find more housing, is the bottom line. So in this case, they're focused on the rental side of it. So the next thing they went into is, why does rental investment in our state continue to diminish? Because it is. Fewer people are coming into the state and investing to build more apartment buildings, more duplexes, more single-family homes. And I know as we drive around, we see all these big developments going on. It doesn't seem like that, but it is. It's certainly not keeping up with the population increase. And there's an interesting conclusion at the end for those of those that, well, then they say, well, let's stop building. But we'll get to that at the end. So one of the reasons there are fewer people investing in our state is because the return is less, is bottom line. You can go to other states. A lot of people I know and have conversations with, it's a pretty common dynamic to talk about investing in other states if you're comfortable investing out of state and managing that dynamic, because the returns are substantially higher in other states. So one of the reasons that is managing building in California. Now, I don't know about the entire state, but I can talk about Los Angeles. And I know that the building department is a bit of a mess. I think it's better. It's gotten better in the last 10 years, maybe 15 years, but it's still a mess. Because we engage with building departments when we're selling properties, and whenever we end up in a small town, you know, I know you were engaging with them, and I've engaged with them in different areas, Joe. You can get someone on the phone and get an answer and find a solution, like in a day or a few days. Something that could take easily weeks or longer to get anything from the city of LA. Mm-hmm. So the inefficiencies related to building departments is extremely costly. Time is money, and the reality is the renters aren't benefiting from that. It's simply costing developers more money. So they have to factor that in to the cost of rent, the cost of sale. So the cost to build are higher for the same reason. Time is money. The time to get permits approved, the time to have inspections done, the time, all these additional times. They were evaluating something, 10 minutes ago about somebody considering, do I do a big addition to sell? And I'm like, okay, how long will it take? What's the cost of the addition? They were coming in the range of $400,000. And then I said, okay, how long is it going to take to get that done? And what's the payments? So in addition to that $400,000, they have to factor in an additional $75,000 on top of that for holding costs. The time it takes.
The cost of the loan and.
Yeah. The time, no, not, well, yes, the cost of the loan that you have to pay while you're in the process of construction.
Yeah.
And who benefits from that? Nobody. Really, nobody benefits. But that cost, if that person decides to do that addition and sell the property, they're not going to absorb that cost. While they're making that decision, they're determining that they're going to pass that on to the purchaser. The costs of delays and inefficiencies are enormous. Then you have cost of labor. Look, I want everybody to get a living wage. I really do, or more. But the bottom line is the cost of labor is so high because the cost of housing is so high. That's a big part of it, right? You go to other states, even if you're hitting a minimum wage, the labor can be less expensive and people can have a higher quality of life. So that's something to keep in mind. Rent control. I bring up rent control as far as the cost because some people, they decide to build or not build because of the rent control guidelines. And they're not balanced. They're not balanced, simply put. Tenants, they give blanket decisions without understanding the nuances of each case. And I know from a distance, you can't be involved in every case, but they just don't seem to get engaged with what's really going on and how to make rent control work better. For those that need it, to give them even more help. And for those that don't, let them navigate their own way and be accountable. So, all costs, services, materials, utilities related to housing have risen tremendously. I mean, the city went out a couple of years ago and gave a very specific contract, and this has been talked about a lot if you're in the apartment industry, probably not at all if you're not, to a single provider to do trash service for multi-units. Okay? Who cares, right? Does it matter? Does that seem like a big deal to you, Joe?
How many are doing that service?
Well,
how many
I just said there used to be a lot, but the city gave the contract to one vendor. Okay? Now, think about that. If the city's choosing one vendor, you would think the city would go out and try to negotiate a good price for that vendor who's going to provide to all of those. No, they didn't. They didn't.
Wow.
It's at the mercy of the vendor and their pricing, and the cost of trash more than doubled. Okay? In an environment, and that's one example, and trust me, there are more. That's an environment where the city is trying to reduce the maximum rent increase from 3% closer to 1.5% or less. Right off the bat, trash, 10% raise. And material costs, labor costs, DWP increases, water increases, sewer increases, all increases dramatically. And basically, I thought it was a great idea. The city should go out and negotiate reduced rates of all of these services. Negotiate. They have the negotiating power.
Yeah.
And then they could say, pass those on to the renters. Or at least here, landlords, we're going to reduce your increase so that renters will get an advantage, but we're going to save you some money over here. No, they haven't. So it's a one-sided. This is where I say people need help. People should get help. I support that, but it can't be one-sided. Again, eventually, landlords are just going to kind of give up. So the attitude towards developers, builders, investors, it's extremely negative, and it's extremely misleading as well. Like everything these days, you find an isolated case, and it doesn't even have to be one. Okay, it could be 1%, and that means there's thousands of people that it may affect. But it's not, 1% compared to 99%. That 1% gets blown out of proportion, and that negativity. Because I'm a property owner. That negativity is just filtering down, creates a horrible relationship between the landlord and tenants. And in general, it creates a bad dynamic of being a landlord. And then what happens is maybe the nicer landlords, the local people who want to engage in helping provide housing, they kind of don't want to deal with that. It's really only the toughest and the grittiest who end up sticking it out through that process. And those are the worst ones for the tenants. They really are. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you keep badgering landlords and keep shortchanging them, you're getting the shittiest ones that are left. And I'm sorry, this probably should be a G-rated show, but
well,
right.
I'm reading through the notes as well, and as you're talking about who is the landlord, that was a big number.
Right. 72% of rental housing is by mom and pop landlords, right? I'm saying 1%, but the bottom line is almost three quarters of housing is by people who have probably moved up into the middle class by owning property and sacrificing. And I assure you, if you don't own investment property, you potentially don't understand the sacrifices that are made for a future gain. It's not about a present gain. It is about a future gain. And that future gain comes if you're diligent and persistent and you stick with it. But it's not a short term.
And in the audience that you were in, what were some of the examples of audience members? Those mom and pops were there, I imagine, right?
Ironically, so sure, there were 6 state assembly members that were having a dialogue, a round table. And there was somebody from Baldwin Hills who grew up in the adjacent community. There was somebody from Pico Rivera. There was somebody from Orange County. They did try to get a diverse group. And they talked about, one of them, a woman, assembly member, her parents, she grew up around housing because they bought multi-units and lived in multi-units. They always had that. So her parents made that sacrifice early. The other one, he remembered his parents buying. They would go buy in, the lower cost communities and hope those communities would rise up, as many of them have, clearly in our city over time. So it was diverse. And of course, there was never a consensus. But in those dialogues, there seemed to be an understanding of the mix, of how to try to find some solutions. Although, on the possible solutions side, I think one of the most important things is to craft better legislation. And the thing I've said since COVID, probably not the first month, but maybe the second or third month into it, was I said, wait a second here. Everybody needs to be accountable. Okay? Rent control just basically establishes across the board, no matter what your income is, controls for everybody, and limits increases. But you could be, earning $300,000 a year and live in a $1,000 a month rent-controlled unit. And I've seen those situations, and I've seen people basically say, great, I'm going to travel the world now and have houses in multiple locations. And is that the case that exists all the time? No, it doesn't. But there should be some measure to regulate that. In my opinion, as a landlord, I think I want to help the people that need the help. It frustrates me when the people that don't need it are getting it, and then I'm shortchanged because of it. So, craft balance legislation. Our legislators, and that panel that they put together, those were aware legislators. They probably went out and, did a little bit of dialogue with them to determine if they even understood the housing market and these dynamics. But most of them don't understand it, and that was very clear to me going through COVID, that a lot of them don't understand the real dynamics and how to craft legislation that is balanced, that will benefit those in need, but not make it so that landlords can be taken advantage of by those who don't need. Another possible solution, and we've seen some of this specifically in LA, going forward to try to help with the supply and demand side, is more conversions. It's expected that there will be a loss of, the numbers they gave were 11 to 17% of retail due to COVID and the COVID environment. So more conversions of this retail space to residential is what we're going to see. And I think that pays off a lot if you it pays off quickly if you do conversions, which is typically not what you see. More often you see demolition and build up. But one of the examples they gave was very interesting, and it stuck in my mind. They said, they can convert those malls, those indoor malls, man. I mean, imagine each store with a central courtyard, and could you see yourself living in a mall?
You're making me think. It's built for community of sorts. I see a park there. I see all sorts of community-like things already built.
Right. Under COVID, I don't know how comfortable people would be with a central living environment, but they can blow out the ceilings and make it open. Now it becomes an open air courtyard. That would be helpful in a lot of those malls. But so we will see more of that. And they basically said, well, that's the low hanging fruit. That's one of the quickest, but you need the legislators to help make that accessible. I say a few lines down, we're gonna get to a point where you either have to incentivize people to build and sell more units, or you're gonna step back and say, government, please build these units. And I think everybody knows that really is not gonna happen. Government is not gonna step in and build things. Or we're just gonna have less, and the prices will probably always stay up. It's one of the two. The assumption, I think, is that if people just leave, some people are going, yay, people are leaving, that's great, we don't want increased density anyways. It's just going to cap the density, but prices will not go down because the supply demand, that equation doesn't change.
I'm jumping ahead here, but I see millennial discussion.
Yeah.
So
that was interesting.
I know sometimes we rant on that, but I guess it was maybe nice to hear some others talk about it instead of...
It was legislators who kind of understood it, and actually two of them were millennials, and they admitted it, but kind of said, well, but I understand the trends maybe of a lot of my friends. So they were saying that, at this point, what you're hearing, a reasonable amount, is that some millennials don't want to own property. They want to stay fluid. They want to stay flexible. They just want to be renters. They want somebody else to take care of these problems. There's a lot of problem. there's many books I'm reading lately on, helicopter parenting, snowplow parenting. So I believe that probably exists for some of these people because that's how they have lived a reasonable amount of their life, to not really face these hard issues. But that said, maybe that's a small group. I believe more wholeheartedly that they do want to own property because it's one of the best paths to financial success. Clearly. It's indisputable. It's because of the power of leveraging that doesn't exist anywhere else as an investment source. But they've justified in their head to some extent that they're comfortable being renters rather than just continually struggling with the fact that it's hard and they can't find a way to buy property. And for many people, it's just, there is a roadblock there. There really is. Educated or not educated, how much you make, if you have debt, we hear about this in the news all the time. For those that are educated, have huge financial burdens, even going into the workforce that they have to work through to pay off student loans. So yeah, it's hard to get into ownership, and a lot of times purchases, even for those that are educated, and we experience this all the time as realtors at this point. So for those of you out there that think you've got to do it all on your own, it happens. But I will say to you, many of the purchases by people under 40, even 45, are a generational purchase. And what I mean by that is there's some family money coming in to help to assist in that purchase. And the most common thing we hear in relation to that is that the parents and the child, they talk about it and they decide that it's better to get that money now and get home ownership and establish that foundation than maybe get the money 20, 30, 40 years from now, and so it's a really nice dialogue between generations that helps move the ball forward. So gosh, I already gave kind of the conclusion that the belief that less housing is going to reduce our population, it's not, and it will keep the prices up. Really, the only way to stabilize pricing is going to be to have more housing built in one way or another. And as far as regulating it, future legislation, the last thing they talked about was whether they were going to try to, and they couldn't answer it, but whether they were going to try to, divide up how they were going to manage between mom and pop owners or institutional ownership. Those who are strictly in the business as a profitable component on a corporate level compared to those that are trying to grow their wealth. And on one level, I would say, why does it matter? From a renter perspective. But I will say that, and a lot of people don't know this, like the rent reimbursement programs that the state is offering also hinges on whether the tenant qualifies. It has nothing to do with the landlord. So if it was a wealthy tenant that chose not to pay their rent, that landlord's not getting reimbursed because of who the tenant is, not because of anything the landlord did. So again, in both cases, trying to keep things balanced and finding what serves the majority and being fair about it, I think is the goals that need to be sought. And hopefully they're not reactionary. What I hope from this dialogue with these people was that, they see the problems, they can identify them, let's go out and solve them. One of the struggles with our government that regulates these things is that they end up being reactionary more often than proactive. And, continual Band-Aids don't solve problems. It just means you're always seeking the next Band-Aid.
This also is timely because of the moratorium on renters in terms of evictions. What have you heard on that? I know it's a very recent story from yesterday, but do you think that rescue is going to come? You're talking about Band-Aids.
Right. Well, right. They did extend, at least FHA extended the moratorium for those that are under forbearance. It is Band-Aids. You're correct. They wanted a broader extension in the Congress, at least the more liberal of the congressional members. In our state, we already have a ton of protections in place. We even have more protections in place in our city in Los Angeles that extend way out. And then, understand, at least in LA, again, I don't know all the systems and how they apply everywhere else, but even once they lift the moratorium, imagine then you're going to have to wait for your court date.
Big domino effect.
Huge. I would venture to say in LA, and I don't know how many people will be faced with eviction. I don't. I would venture to say that when they lift it, and there will be no good time to lift it. Guaranteed.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, next month, next week, next year, a decade from today will not be a good time to lift it. So at some point, the politicians are just going to have to suck it up and do what seems right for the timing. Now, I get there's been the Delta variant, there's more issues. There are real issues out there. But they can start narrowing it down to those who actually need it, but it's still just a blanket moratorium across the board for those whether they need it or not.
Well, I also know, right, they're talking about the states, they've got the money, and that's the other stoppage, right? Just a bureaucratic slowdown.
For the states that have the money, it's an absolute bureaucratic slowdown. But look, as a property owner, I mean, at least I'm in a position where I could wait for it. Yeah. Maybe there are some that can't. But again, it's not just that. You need to now go back and have tenant cooperation. How do you think that dynamic is between landlord and tenant who hasn't been paying rent? Now the tenant has to step up and say, hey, I'm going to help you get your money. Yeah, there's going to be some issues there. They're at 100%. It's going to be, it's going to be a bit of a shit show. It's tough.
Well, thanks for going to this, because I obviously wasn't there, but I know you're really on this stuff, so I learned something.